Well, if you love hockey fights as much as I do, grab your favorite beverage and a snack, because today I'm going to tell you all about the three faces on the Mount Rushmore of hockey fight content providers. Hey everybody, welcome into Clearing the Benches, your one-stop shop for daily fresh hockey content. If you go ahead and hit your subscribe button right now, every single day we'll bring you in a new video to enjoy. Well, today we're going to go into a deep dive, and it's going to be about one of my favorite subjects. I love a good hockey fight, and I am a little bit older than most of you, so I've got a little bit more life experience in the hockey fight arena. So I'm going to tell you about the three guys that basically bought hockey fight content from the 70s through the 80s and 90s up to where we have it today with hockeyfights.com. So, let's get started. First of all, you need to know, in the 1970s, okay, if you were not home to physically watch the game on TV when it happened, you missed out. That was it. You were done. The next day when you went to school or the bus stop or work and everybody was talking about the game, you had no idea what they were talking about because they had not invented VCRs or ways to record games and that you could watch it back later whenever you needed to. None of that existed. It was all about being home watching the game live. There were no answering machines. Technology was not nearly what it is today. So, you know, today you want to watch a hockey fight, you just reach into your pocket, pull out your phone, and there you go. So let me go back to the 1970s, okay? Again, we're talking long before the internet, long before anybody had a home computer. There were no VCRs. Again, there was no way to record a game and watch it back later. What there was newsletters and fanzines, like a fan club. Somebody would take out an article in the back of the Hockey News saying, hey, I have a newsletter. And one of the first guys that did that, he was basically the godfather of hockey fight content. And his name was Sandy Vigilante. And he was a postal worker out of Nutley, New Jersey in the late 70s. And what he did was, on paper and pencil, he wrote down on a pad, he kept every fight. Every day he went through the newspapers. Again, you didn't have the internet back then. You had to go through the newspapers. You had to read the box scores. So what Sandy Vigilante did back in the 70s was he took his newspapers, he scoured them, and he kept a log of all the guys that fought. And then, so that he could, like, you know, have more information about it, he lived in New York, so I'm assuming he was going to Madison Square Garden. Maybe he was going out to Nassau Coliseum at the time. But he would hang out at the players' entrance, and he would talk to players, fans, coaches who actually witnessed those fights firsthand. And he would keep it in his little log. And now he knew, you know, when Nicky Fatiou fought Ben Wilson, you know, it was a standoff until the end when Fatiou hit him with an uppercut. These were the types of notes that were kept back in the day. So, you know, again, it seems very primitive, but this is all there was back then. So we didn't know any better. This was the best we had. So again, he went around to the local rinks and he asked people who saw these fights, hey, can you give me your opinion? And then he started up a newsletter, and his newsletter was called Mixing It Up. And in Mixing It Up, there was a section called Ask Dr. Fight. So literally, again, there's no email. Everything is, if you want something to get somewhere, you had to write a letter, go down to the post office, or put it in your mailbox, and you had to mail it. And usually it was like about a month or 6 weeks later, you would hear back from the people. That's just how long everything took back in the days. When you bought anything on TV back in the day, at the very end, they always said it's going to take 4 to 6 weeks before you get your product. And that's just how it was. It wasn't like you ordered it in the morning and it was here in the afternoon like we have with Amazon now. It was much more primitive. So a guy like Sandy Vigilante, I mean, what a mountain he had to climb just to get all the information that now we have just reaching in a pocket and pulling out a phone. So I would say, you know, if there's a Mount Rushmore of hockey fight content providers, Sandy Vigilante is face number one up on that list. Again, he had a newsletter and it was called Mixing It Up. You would write a question into him. Hey, who do you think is a better fighter? You know, Bob Probert or Domi. And then he would write his answer in the next edition of Mixing It Up. So again, you know, maybe a couple of weeks later in the mail, here came your newsletter, and you know, you went down to your Ask Dr. Fight section and you saw if he answered your question in there. That's how it worked back in the day. It's not just all this one-stop grab what you want while you're here. And then, you know, in the late 70s into the early 80s, now you start getting into the electronic era. Now you start getting into, you know, you have answering machines. Again, when I was a kid, if my family went to the movies and you called my house, nobody knew you called my house. We didn't have an answering machine. It just rang until you hung up, and then you tried to call me again later until somebody in my family picked up. That's just how it was back in the day. It seems very primitive, and now looking back, it kind of was a little primitive, and I'm glad that things are the way they are now electronically, that's for sure. But again, now you're getting into the late 70s, early 80s. Now you start getting into the electronic era where they're making electronics. You know, the first computer used to be the size of, like, you know, a building, and now it's in your pocket. When the 70s started getting into the 80s, everything started to slimline a little bit. They started making things more friendly for the consumer to be able to figure out how to use a computer, what you can do on it, all of the different nuances. And again, this was all brand new. This was like looking into the future. It was very, very interesting times. But as you can imagine, you know, now you start getting into like the electronic era and things are starting to advance. So as you can imagine, a guy like Sandy Vigilante, his newsletters and his fanzines, those fan clubs, they start to wane in popularity. You know, now people are starting to see more things. Now the invention of the VCR just came out in the early 80s, and now you are able to record a game while you're not home, and you can watch that game whenever you want and as many times as you want. That was a big, big deal back in the day. That was the first time it had ever happened. So we are going to get out of the 70s and we are going to get over into the 1980s. And in the 1980s, like we talked about, now you've got the electronic era. VCRs were a way to record games, and you know, now everybody's like, holy cow, I can be at two places at once, and you'll never miss the game. So every day at work or school when they're talking about the game, you knew what they were talking about because you watched the game too. Satellite dishes, and I'm talking not the ones like Dish, I'm talking these things were like half the size of your backyard. These were literally like 12, 15 feet tall. They were dangerous. A baseball player named Bo Diaz, he played for the Cincinnati Reds. He was out working on his satellite dish one day and the thing fell over on him and killed him. They were massive. It's the same size satellites that like you see when you drive by a TV station and they've got those big satellites in the parking lot. That's what you had to have back in the early mid-80s when you started to get into advancement of the electronic era. And now this is a big thing. Now you can start watching out-of-market NHL games. Forever as a kid, you turned on Channel 9, it was just the Rangers or the Islanders. And then later on, I don't even think the Devils were on regular TV. I think when they came to Jersey, they already had cable TV. So in the 80s comes a guy, and his name is Andy Boemer, and he was young. He was in like his mid to late 20s, and in the 80s he was from St. Paul, Minnesota. And now you've got satellite dishes, now the VCR is out, and now there's ways for people to record all of these games. So what Andy Boemer did was he somehow got people to, I don't know if it was he put an ad in the back of the hockey news or what, but somehow he was able to get people all across the United States and Canada to send him VHS tapes that had hockey games recorded on it. And again, he would just go back to the box score, fast forward through the tape until he got to the fight. and then he would, you know, make his notes on the fight, and he had his own system. So he got all of these tapes that came into him, and he starts editing them and splicing them in, and now he's just got like a 2-hour hockey fight tape. There is nothing but one fight ends, the next fight starts. One fight ends, the next fight starts. 2 straight hours. At the time, this was unheard of. Nobody had this. This was like the very, very beginning. This is like, as far as hockey fight content goes, this is the guy inventing the wheel. So what happened was, he's got all of these people, and he basically did was he spliced together these tapes, and he must have got thousands of tapes, because I saw his ad in the back of the Hockey News in 1987, and there was just a phone number there, and all it said was Hockey Fight VHS tapes. And I called him up, and I physically spoke to Andy Boemer on the phone. He basically said, hey, how's it going? Oh, you're a big fight fan? Cool, what's your address? Let me send you my lists. And, you know, like a month later in the mail, I get this big manila envelope. It says A. Boemer in the corner, so I get all excited. And I pull it out. And basically all it is just on paper, about 50 pieces of paper. And each piece of paper has got about 60 or 70 fights listed on it. And each individual tape had its own name. So sometimes he had... if you wanted just to buy all Rangers fights, he could send you a tape, and the only fights on there were Ranger fights, Canucks fights, whoever it was. He had a tape pretty much for every team. If you wanted just, you know, Clark Gillies, Bobby Nystrom, Nick Fatiu, Bob Probert tapes. One of the most famous hockey fight tapes in history is called the Bruise Brothers. I'm sure there's a ton of you out there who probably have got that somewhere in your closet. I know I do. I was looking for it the other day, and you know what? It's in the attic, and I didn't feel like going up there. But I'll tell you what, he put out tapes that everybody wanted. And now once the word starts to spread, the popularity increases immensely. Now you got people trading tapes. Now you got guys going, hey, I got this hockey fight tape. And you're like, oh, I got one. And basically what you would do is grab your VCR out of your living room, take it over to your buddy's house, hook it up so that you could play out of one and record into another. And you would sit there for 4 hours, and you know, you couldn't do it. You had to do it in real time. It wasn't where you could speed up the process. So what you would do is go to your buddy's house, and you know, you throw in the tapes, and you and your buddy be in the living room beating each other up for 4 hours while you're watching these awesome fight tapes. And then when it was all said and done, now instead of having one fight tape, you got 2. And that's how it worked. And everybody I knew started collecting fight tapes, and everybody had their own favorite guy. And they would say, oh, I got the Clark Gillies fight tape, or, oh, I got the Chicago Blackhawks fight tape. Let's trade. It's just how it was. And then Andy Boemer. So you figure this out. You're at the beginning of the electronic era. The NHL now has got to start learning about piracy laws. You know, when people at the beginning of the game, when they say, oh, this game is copyright, blah, 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 no intent, and you can't redistribute or reprogram, whatever they say. Well, Andy Boemer kind of went, they don't mean me. So Andy Boemer went around and he asked a bunch of people, and I think he may have even asked a couple of lawyers, or he asked a couple of people. I don't know if he called down to the local TV station. But somehow Andy Boemer came up with this idea that if one of his hockey fights was 90 seconds or less, it was okay, and the NHL wouldn't have a problem with it. Well, in fact, the NHL did have a problem with it, to the point that they sent Andy Boemer a letter, and they said, hey, this is the NHL. You're ripping off our product. You're making money off the NHL, and that's illegal. What you're doing is 100% illegal. And you know what Andy Boemer did? And God bless this kid. He writes the NHL a letter back telling them, mellow out. No one's getting hurt here. Everyone's having a good time. That's just a crazy thing to say. Somebody's serving you up with a potential lawsuit, and you come back with, don't worry about it. I'll tell you, that Andy Boemer kid, he had a big set of stones, that's for sure, in my opinion. And when I talked to the guy, he was just a regular guy. You know, he wasn't like Mr. Robot or whatever. He was just like, hey, what's your address? He wrote it down probably on a paper towel and sent me, his list. So then what I did was, I get his list, and now I'm, you want to buy all 50 of these tapes. You're like, oh my God. And the tapes at the time were probably like 20 bucks, 25 bucks, which was a little expensive. You're talking, and I bought my very first tape off Andy Boemer in 1987, and I want to say I paid like $24.99 for the Bruise Brothers tape. I had to have that tape. So that was, a long time ago, and again, this is like prehistoric history. You're going from, VHS tape, something that looks like this. You got this old plastic hunky thing right here. And, this was the hockey fight underworld. It was like the illegal underground dark side of hockey. But this is what they came on back in the day. And to be honest with you, even though CDs and DVDs were all popular, I don't know a whole lot of people that had hockey fight DVDs. I think by then everybody had just gone over to hockeyfights.com. So again, when Andy Boemer sends this letter to the NHL telling them to chill out, this is kind of where Andy Boemer fades out of the picture. I heard several different rumors, and they all started off with Andy Boemer got sued big time by the NHL, forced him into bankruptcy, and according to some people, he may have done harm to himself because of it. He got himself in so deep financial troubles. But I don't want to think that's what happened to him. I want to hope that he's off, in hockey fight heaven somewhere watching all the fights and enjoying it. But he was the guy in the 80s, and that was like a real big step, from, it's like black and white into color television. When you went from paper newsletters to VHS tapes where you were physically able to watch the games whenever, watch the fights whenever you wanted to. And let me tell you something about these hockey fight tapes, okay? So if you like heavy metal or if you like rock and roll, maybe you've heard of Riki Rachtman. He used to host K-Rock Loveline in Los Angeles. He was the host of Headbangers Ball, and he had a very, very, very popular heavy metal club in LA called the Cathouse. And I used to run into Riki Rachtman and Tammy Down from Faster Pussycat at all the Kings games. And when I found out those guys were hockey fight fans, I got with them, and I had by then accumulated, we're talking about 1990, 91 when I met Riki. I probably had about 30 hockey fight tapes, so I probably had about 60 hours worth. So Riki asked me if I would make him copies of all the tapes, and he had a big surprise for me. So I said, okay. So the next Tuesday, because the Cathouse was only open Tuesday nights, 836 North Highland in Hollywood, and they opened at 10:30 on a Tuesday night, and they went until like 2 o'clock. Well, Riki Rachtman had all the big bands play at the Cathouse. Guns N' Roses, Pearl Jam, Suicidal Tendencies, anybody you can think of, they played at the Cathouse. And what Riki's big surprise for me was the next Tuesday when I went down there, Riki grabbed me, walked me down to the bar, and he said, wait until this band gets off stage. The band finishes playing, and now all the TVs pop up all around the venue, behind all the bars, and Riki's got the hockey fights showing on the TVs, and everybody is losing their mind. You got the guys from every big band you could think of going, holy cow, what's this? Again, this was all new. Nobody had access to this. As much as all these guys loved watching a good fight, they had no idea how to get a hold of a tape that had 2 hours of straight hockey fights on it when I did. So that was a really cool time too. The Cathouse was a lot of fun. So if you've ever been there and you ever saw the hockey fights, Riki used to call me Fight Tape Frankie. That was how he remembered me. And Riki and I were big Bob Probert fans at the time. We looked so forward to those Probert fights, especially the Domi rivalry. That was a lot of good times. So if you ever run into Riki Rachtman, he's a big hockey fan, and he definitely loves his hockey fights. So Andy Boemer kind of fades off into the distance, and now we're going to get into the 90s and the 2000s. And now we're talking about VCRs have turned into, like, DVRs around probably like 1998. Yeah, 1998, I would say, like, DVRs first came out. And the internet was already starting to take off. And I I gotta say, even at the beginning, the internet was still kind of like its infant stages. It was like the first time where you could communicate with other people, like you could go back and forth, or you could email somebody, or you could chat with somebody. It was all very, very primitive compared to how cleaned up it is right now. And it used to be like if you had a Yahoo account, all you had to do was say the person's name at yahoo.com, and they got your email, and now you're in communication with them. It was a big, big, big advancement at the time from everybody, file cabinets and files and paper and typewriters and pens and papers, to now everything's on the internet. And let me tell you, as somebody who lived through both lives, the pre and post internet, the post internet world is pretty good. That is for sure. Anything you want, you got it just like that. By about 2000, pretty much everybody in the world had an email address, and pretty much everybody had some sort of a computer in their house, whether it was a laptop or one of those big old Apple computers that they used to have back in the day. It was all different colors, and it was like they were huge compared to what they are now. But again, by about 2000, everybody's got those, and now the internet is pretty much becoming an everyday thing and starting to consume people's lives. At first, people used to just go to the internet for a little entertainment here and there. And now look at us. Nobody can go more than 30 seconds without checking their phone for something. And then just about then, the majority of the people, like I said, were getting their entertainment from the internet. They would go and they would, just look for stuff that they had never seen before. And again, this was a first chance to see something like, if you lived in New York and you had never traveled out of New York, now you can see some stuff, other than Encyclopedia Britannica or, some old dictionary. You could actually see pictures, and then, not long after that, videos of what all these other places look like. So the people started getting a lot of their entertainment now off the internet. It's switching from a little bit to people are on the internet more and more and more. And now we advance to hockeyfights.com. And I got to tell you, as far as like a website that's got everything, and I just really think they do everything right, it's hockeyfights.com. And I went back and did a little history, and there's a gentleman named David Singer, and he looks like he's probably about my age. And when he was growing up, and we're talking probably around the same time Sandy Vigilante was doing it, Andy Boemer was doing it, David Singer was keeping his own logs of his own fight tapes, and he wanted to keep track of, who fought who and how they did. And something very interesting about both David Singer, because I saw an interview with him not too long ago, and I'll put that interview down in the comment section or in the description. And both David Singer, probably around 2012, 2013, 14, somewhere in there. And then Andy Boemer, way back in the mid-'80s. Both of them said that they thought there would be a very good chance that one day fighting would be out of hockey. Andy Boemer said he was making all those tapes. I asked him, I said, how do you get so many tapes? And he goes, oh, they're going to get rid of fighting in 2 years. I got to make my money when I can. That was his response. So he thought, like, in earnest, he really thought that hockey was going to be done by, like, 1980. Fighting would be done in hockey by, like, 1988. And, of course, it wasn't. And in an interview, with David Singer, he said the same thing. He said, he loves hockey fights, but he also loves the game itself. And that's how I am, too. I could watch two kids playing street hockey out in front of my house and be entertained. They don't have to get in a fight, for me to enjoy it. That's for sure. Does a good hockey fight enhance the experience of a game? Definitely. And does it often change the momentum of the game? Definitely. That's most of the time why guys fight. Back in the day, it was much different. You had guys who just fought because they woke up pissed off and they couldn't wait to fight anybody. Now things are a little more set up, staged. Like, I think they email each other before the game. Hey, you want to fight me today? I don't know. It just seems a little bit staged, I guess would be the best word that I could use. So, David Singer, he has taken hockeyfights.com to the new level. Whenever I go on that site, I love everything about it. He makes it very simple to find the fight you're looking for, or find the guy you're looking for, or find the answer to the question, you know, who won this fight and who won that fight. But, you know, as far as these guys go, really, those three names, Sandy Vigilante, Andy Boemer, David Singer, if there's a Mount Rushmore of hockey fight content, those are your three faces that are up there. I don't see any other faces that would be up there, that's for sure. And who doesn't love hockeyfights.com? I know I do. I go there all the time. You know, I hate to say it, if I'm out at dinner and I come home and I missed a fight on TV, the first thing I do is go run and see if somebody put it up already, and if I can, you know, watch to see who won. So that's going to be it as far as like the three guys go. And then I'm going to take a minute or two here and I'm going to talk about some of my personal favorite fighters. Now, I'm a little bit older and I'm going to say this. I don't think a lot of the guys that are in the league that are fighting now would make it in the 70s or 80s, maybe even in the early 90s. It was a very, 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 way more violent game than it is now. And I could see guys like Ryan Reeves, Jacob Trouba, maybe Delorier, to an extent, Matt Martin, the kid in CBJ, Olivier, he's a throwback type of guy. He's a little guy, but he can throw him. I don't think there's more than just a handful of guys who would have been able to play back then and not quit playing pro hockey. It was very, very violent. And again, it was a different style of game. If you were a superstar, you had a giant target on your back. You knew the first time you went out on the ice, somebody was sending a goon over the boards to try to take your head off. And it was up to your coach to have a guy to equal that out. So when the Flyers came out to Long Island and they were looking to pick on Mike Bossy, they had to go through like 6 guys: Clark Gillies, Bobby Nystrom, Gord Lane, Gary Howard. All these guys were maniacs when they dropped the gloves. It is not like now where they all stand there in posture and they do all this. It's like you're posing for a statue. Back then, guys were looking to hurt each other big time. So anyway, what I'm going to do real quick is I'm going to go over my top 10 favorite all-time fighters, okay? And top up on my list, and I never saw the guy fight. He finished playing long before I was probably, you know, out of diapers. But Gordie Howe, okay? There's a famous picture of Gordie Howe fishing. It's a black and white picture. He's got no shirt on. He's probably about 40 years old. He looks like Hercules in the picture. And I'm pretty sure that day he could have stepped out of the boat and he would have taken on Ryan Reeves, Delorier. He would have taken them all on. No problem. That was a different era. You had to literally fight for your life back then. And I talked to a lot of older people. We had season tickets for the Rangers in the 80s. I saw a ton of Rangers, Flyers fights. There were, you know, Stu Grimson when the Blackhawks came in, Probert and Kosar. These were just crazy, violent eras. And it's just not like it is today. And when I looked and I asked all the guys back in the 80s, hey, who do you think is the all-time best fighter? All the older guys, anybody said Gordie Howe would beat this guy up and then he would go have a sandwich, come back and beat up the rest of the team. That's apparently how deadly Gordie Howe was in a fight. And when you look back in hockey history, if you read some of the articles that were written back in the day, a lot of times guys had a tough guy and they were like, yeah, I'm going to come into Detroit and teach Gordie Howe a lesson. And that guy would get his skull caved in by Gordie Howe. Gordie Howe is not afraid to hit you with the stick or spear you. There's a famous picture when he's playing against the Russians and he's literally got his stick in the guy's cup. And the guy's like, you know, going down in pain. So as far as my personal #1 all-time fighter, again, I never saw him fight. But everything I heard when I saw the size of the guy and I saw what he looked like with no shirt on, I say he could take his chances with anybody. Now, personally, again, these are my favorite fighters. These are not in any order of like, you know, who I think is the greatest. These are my favorite fighters of all time. Next up is a kid growing up in New York. there was nobody better to watch than Nicky Fatiou. Didn't matter what team came into town or when the Rangers went to their town, if there was a tough guy on that team, you knew at some point during the game he was going to fight Nicky Fatiou. And Nicky Fatiou was a boxer from Staten Island. This guy was tough and he knew how to box. You see these guys all squaring off now. They don't know what they're doing. When Nicky Fatiou squared off, he's throwing jabs and big haymakers. I mean, Nicky Fatiou could fight, and I know I saw him lose a few fights. Everybody loses a few fights except Gordie Howe, apparently. But Nicky Fatiou was a guy, no matter who, Paul Holmgren, big guys, these are 6'5", 225-pound men, and he literally put these guys on their backs. So as far as for me, my favorite is Nicky Fatiou. Next up, as far as tough guys go, for me, Clark Gillies. You go back and you watch those Islanders series. Anything that they ever played against the Flyers. There's one big brawl they had against the Bruins, right, in the playoffs. First game of the playoffs, end of the first period. Now it's just a bench-clearing brawl. You watch Clark Gillies, Jethro as they called him. Jethro knew how to get you tied up, and then Jethro knew how to throw an uppercut that would catch you in the jaw and your knees would shake. More than once, and there's plenty on video. If you want to see a big, mean guy, he had to protect a lot of guys, and he was playing on what they call the Trio Grande line, and it was him, Mike Bossy, and Brian Tocchet. Between them, they probably have won close to 20 Stanley Cups, literally, with all the ones that Tocchet won as a coach. Bossy and Gillies won 4 each, Tocchet 4 each. All right, so maybe closer to 15 than 20 Stanley Cups. And then next up, I've got Bob Probert. You know what? I loved Proby. I loved watching him fight. I was a big Proby fan. I didn't exactly live the cleanest lifestyle in the 80s and 90s, and I was kind of going along the Bob Probert route, and he was somebody I could identify by. I had my own personal issues going on, and he obviously had a ton of personal issues in his life, and I just related to him. And I actually got lucky enough, one time to just briefly, walk by him at the Forum Club in LA and, wave to him, and he kind of grunted to me. He was a big boy, and I'll tell you what, when you watched him fight, he was another guy. He didn't fight just to fight. He fought because he wanted to jack you up. And when you look at those fights against Domi, he wants to kill Domi in those fights. And I guess, they all got bought into Gil Stein's office the morning of the big fight at the Garden, and Gil Stein was the commissioner before Bettman, and he told them, nope, if you guys fight, you're going to get fined. And yet that night, Bob Probert skated right up to Domi, and according to Bob Probert, he said, come on, you little midget, let's go. And apparently Domi was like, dude, what about the fine? And Proby said, screw the fine. I'm going to start throwing, so you better get ready. And that's when it went down. So when I look at a guy like Bob Probert, another guy, he had no rules when it came to fighting. He was a guy, a lot of people don't realize when the Red Wings took Steve Yzerman, number 4 overall, 2 rounds later, Bob Probert, and there you go. Now you got a guy who can protect your superstar. Another guy that I'm sure a lot of people don't know about is the Bomber, Kenny Baumgartner. He was a lefty, a southpaw. Kenny Baumgartner was awesome. The ladies loved him. He had big blonde flowing mullet going on, and he would make sure his helmet came off and his shirt came off in a fight. And let me tell you something, if you've never heard of Kenny Baumgartner, go back and watch some of the Bombers' fights. He fought everybody, and he held his own against Probert, McSorely, Domi, Wendel Clark, anybody you can think of from that era who was a fighter. Kenny Baumgartner fought. And there's also a very famous fight that you could probably find on hockeyfights.com, because David Singer's got everything on there, and I love that about them. There was a fight in juniors, you're talking probably early to mid-'80s, and Bob Probert and Kenny Baumgartner are rolling around on the floor in the penalty box. They're both on their backs in the penalty box, and it's just a real crazy fight. So that's another one of my favorite guys to watch when I'm looking for fights, is Kenny Baumgartner. And then obviously Marty McSorely, him and Dave Semenko had the You know, they had to protect Gretzky. And again, this was an era where you needed more than one McSorely on your team. That's why the Kings had McSorely and Baumgartner. That's why they had other guys. Mike Krushelnyski, who came over in that trade, was a huge man. He's like 6'3", and that guy is very, very strong. They had him out there alongside Gretzky a lot. And again, this was all because if you were that good back in the day, they targeted your superstar. I'm sorry, there are some smaller guys in the league right now that I see, you know, I watch Clayton Keller out here. He plays a very perimeter game. Nick Schmaltz, I'm sorry, I'll just come out and say it. They would have never made it back in the day. They would have got crushed and they would have just gone back home. That would have been it for them. They play too much of a perimeter game nowadays for a lot of these guys to transfer. And a lot of people sit there and they say, oh, they're better skaters now. They can't fight as well. I look at, when I see a fight break out, the first thing I look to see when I'm trying to figure out who's going to win, generally the guy with better skating balance is going to win that fight. When you look at a guy like Jacob Trouba, when he gets in a fight, Trouba doesn't do a whole lot. He's not all posture. Trouba just gets in there and he goes. But when you look, he is rock solid on his skates. You're not going to shake him and get him off his skates. Sometimes I see, you know, the Ryan Reeves, the Liam O'Briens, guys get shook up a little bit. Next thing you know, they lose their balance. I don't see that much with guys like Jacob Trouba. Landeskog is another guy. Excuse me, I know he's not playing all that much. He's not playing at all right now, but you know, when he played, he was another guy. He stood up for his teammates, and when he got in a fight, you know, he went straight at you, and he had really good balance. So, again, when I look at guys getting into a scrap, the first guy that I see has better balance, that's who I'm going to think is going to win that fight. When you go back to even the olden days, and I think he just passed recently, which is very sad to hear, was Glen Cochrane. You want to see a rough dude? This guy, if you saw him at a wedding, he would scare you. This dude was mean. He had that Fu Manchu. He was tall and lanky, and he wasn't afraid to go up to whoever you were and just go boom and punch you right in the face. Glen Cochrane. You want to see some awesome fights? When he was on Philly, they were wearing the Cooperalls, and it's just a really way cool look to it. And then when he was on Vancouver, he was you know, he's out there with Tiger Williams and Craig Cox, some guys who really know their way around the ring. They could take care of business with their fists, that's for sure. Watch the Craig Cox-Nicky Fotiu fight. Cox is C-O-X-E, and Fotiu is F-O-T-I-U. Go back and look at those fights. Those are guys standing there going like this, punching each other in the face like 100 times to see who's going to be the first guy to stop throwing. So Glen Cochrane, another one of my favorites. A mean dude, love to get into it. And then obviously you got a couple guys that are, you know, still hanging around in the modern day. And Craig Berube and Rick Tocchet. You know, I think both of these guys, I think Berube had 303 NHL fights. And I want to say Tocchet came in about 293. I think he was exactly 10 fights less than Berube. Watch either of these two guys in a fight. This is why they command your attention as coaches, because they can go into the video room, flip a tape on, and go, that's me with the long hair beating the crap out of a guy you wouldn't even want to go to a wedding with because you'd be so scared. They were mean back in the day. If you have never seen Craig Berube, the Chief, man, he had crazy long hair. I know Toc is bald now, but Tocchet had some flow back in the day. And when Rick Tocchet was first coming up on the Flyers, it was around 1986, 87, and I was going to all the Ranger games at the time. And the Rangers had just called up George McPhee, who I believe had just won the Hobie Baker Award as the best college hockey player in America. And now we all know George McPhee is the GM or president of Vegas. You know, he put together that roster that won the cup, him and McCrimmon out in Vegas. But in 1987, they were both like 22 years old, and they were full of piss and vinegar. And you want to watch a couple of good fights? Watch George McPhee against Rick Tocchet. Those are some brawls. Tocchet's got a scar under his eye from George McPhee. McPhee was a little guy, but, you know, Flyers had a guy, Dave Brown. He was a maniac. He once broke Thomas Sandstrom's jaw with a shot to the face with the stick. George McPhee tried to fight Dave Brown. Didn't go so well for McPhee, but he had the stones to get in there and give it a shot. Next up, Rick Tocchet. Obviously, you want to watch a guy who handled his business. Tocchet, man, oh man. He would just get in there and jackhammer you. He was a guy, he did not waste any time in a fight. He grabbed you and he started throwing, and if he didn't like the positioning that he had on you, he would change it up real quick mid-fight, and he'd start throwing lefty, righty, overs, unders, a lot. And, you know, back in the day, the idea was to get your opponent's jersey over his head, and you start throwing uppercuts, and you feed him his lunch that way. Now, you know, a helmet comes off, the fight's over. Guy's jersey comes over his head, the fight's over. Different world now. So, when I look at what's going on, you know, in the world today, as far as fights go, and I look at guys like Berube and Tocchet, they could play in this league for sure, especially Tocchet. But as far as, like, they would stick out a little bit. You know, they would throw these big hits that, like, somebody would be like, hey, you know, it's like Matthew Rempe. The guy's out there destroying guys. Yeah, 1 or 2 times, you know, he chicken winged somebody. That's how it was, like 5 times a game back in the day. They made a big thing, like Rempe pulled a machine gun out and shot everybody on the ice. It was no big deal. And I say that because back in the day, you saw that, like I said, 5 times every game. And usually when you saw a guy throw an elbow on your guy, you're like, oh, good, this is going to be a fight later because that guy's not going to take that from him. He's going to go back and do something. That's another big difference is guys nowadays, I don't see, you know, I see guys get face washed in like post-whistle scrums and then they just skate away. Who the hell lets you face wash them and you don't give them a quick jab back? Anyway, so when I look at all of these guys here, again, the last guy now I got on my list, and I know people are going to say, how could you have him 10th on your list? I got Domi 10th on my list. Listen, I'll tell you what, he fought a lot of these other guys, and he did not always win. I know he fought Tocchet, Berube, Domi, Probert. He didn't win all those fights. There were some fights in there. Domi took some shots. Listen, Domi's got the big name because he was in the most fights in NHL history. 333 fights in the NHL. That is a very busy beaver. That is a dude taking care of his business and some. So, but again, when I look back at, you know, guys from the 70s, 80s, and Gordie Howe is a monster. I'm just going to go out on a limb and say I'm pretty sure Gordie Howe could take Domi in a fight. And I would even go out and say that he would take Nick Fotiu in a fight only because he had better balance and he was, I'm going to say, stronger than Fotiu. I don't think there was very many guys in the league ever that were as strong as Gordie Howe. And again, I would put Howe up against all these other guys. And when you put Domi up against them, you know, again, Domi was in a lot of fights and he won a ton of them. And he was a very intimidating factor and he was very useful for the teams that he played on. But going up against some of these other guys here, I'm not so sure that he would have won all of those fights. And then there's a couple of other guys that I personally used to just love to watch. And I'm sure there's plenty of their fights on hockeyfights.com if you've never heard of these guys. But Darren Langdon. Darren Langdon was a good fighter. He played on the Rangers and I believe Toronto Maple Leafs. Darren Langdon was a guy who would just skate up to Domi, Probert, any of these guys that wanted to fight. He'd give him a little something, go, hey, you interested? So Darren Langdon could fight. He did not lose a lot of fights. So go back and watch some of your Darren Langdon fights. And then a guy was a little bit more of a middleweight, but I loved watching him. When he was on the Rangers, he just seemed to go after every other team's tough guy. And a lot of times he fed them their lunch. And I'm talking about Brandon Prust. He was only in the league, I'll probably say about 7 years. But I really enjoyed watching Prusty fight. That guy, he really put his heart into it. Like I said, he was more of a middleweight, but he took on all the heavyweights. And a lot of those guys he did really well against. And then, you know, somebody from the, older times. And this to me is the guy I always go back to when I see a kid get drafted and they say, oh, how he's going to be a team leader. Wendel Clark got drafted and then he proceeded to have 54 fights in his first 2 NHL seasons. I'm pretty sure they named him captain, if not his rookie year, like his second year in the league. So you want to go back and you want to watch a little bulldog. Wendel Clark was not that big. He was very, very compact, but he was the ultimate package. He had elite skills as far as playing the game goes, and he had the mentality of a brawler. He would be the first guy to jump over the bench and come over and try to feed you your lunch. So anyway, that's going to about wrap it up for me today. I just wanted to go through the history of all the, hockey fight content providers. And again, I think there's just the three guys on the Mount Rushmore. Sandy Vigilante from the 70s, Andy Boemer, 80s and into the 90s, and then David Singer with hockeyfights.com. And again, I loved reading newsletters as a kid. I loved watching Andy Boemer's VHS tapes, even though a lot of them were grainy and, kind of faded in and faded out. And then, of course, who doesn't love what David Singer's doing over at hockeyfights.com? Like I said, you go to there, you find out who won a fight. Heck, I even saw an article that said players would come up to David Singer and thank him and say, hey, I had a fight coming up against this guy. I didn't know if he was a southpaw or a righty, so I went to hockeyfights.com and I watched your video and it taught me how to fight this guy. So again, those are the three faces on the Mount Rushmore of hockey fight content providers. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you enjoyed it enough to hit the subscribe button, hit the like button. Hey, let's have a back and forth in the comment section. I know that there's a lot of you older dudes watching this video. Let me know who your favorite fighters were and why. Obviously, you know who some of my favorites are, and I follow this very, very in depth. So I don't want to say I know what I'm talking about, but I have an idea of what I'm talking about. So definitely hit me up down in the comments section. And I can't thank you enough for watching this video today. I looked forward to doing it for a really long time. And I just love hockey fights. So I wanted to make sure that everybody was filled in on any blanks that might be out there. So again, please, if you could, hit the subscribe button, like. And as we always do here at Clearing the Benches, let them know you're out there.